This seminar in this series of seminars organized by the New Russian Nationalism Project, or NEORUS for short. We used to have this 4 times per year, and this time we have been extremely lucky to have Professor Charles King from Georgetown University, Professor of International Affairs and Government. His CV is so long, I think we would eat up too much of our time if I should really start enumerating all the things he has done and all the articles and books he has written. He has been but just to give you the short version, he started with as a Romania expert, and then he has moved around the Black Sea clockwise. And then what he will be talking about here today is the Caucasus in Russian politics and strategy. But his most recent book, which has it come out?
Last fall.
Last fall, right? Okay, is on let's see, Midnight at Pera Palace: The Birth of Modern Istanbul. So he has moved on to Turkey, and then sooner or later he will close the circle and go and come back and have done the entire Black Sea region. So but the most relevant book for this seminar is The Ghost of Freedom: A History of the Caucasus, including, of course, a number of more specialized articles. So please, Charles, take the floor, and we will love to hear what you have to tell us.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks very much for inviting me. Thank you, Professor Kolsto, and thanks to Helga Blakkestrud for arranging all of this as well here at NUPI. Very happy to be with you. Happy to be with you to talk about perhaps a rather sobering set of subjects, and that has to do with contemporary politics in the Caucasus region. I'm going to focus on the North Caucasus, or the portion of the historic and geographical Caucasus region that is, of course, inside the Russian Federation. And I'm going to be dealing with a whole host of places that for some of you may have been unfamiliar, which is why I'm going to keep this map up here as I talk throughout the lecture today. Places like Kabardino-Balkaria and Karachay-Cherkessia, perhaps less known in this part of the world than in Russia itself, although I should say what happens in these regions is to a great degree unknown even in Russia, even to Russians themselves. And tragically better known places such as Chechnya and Dagestan, which feature into Western reporting on Russia rather frequently and feature into Russian reporting on Russia itself rather frequently. Now, I should say there is a standard narrative about this part of the world that you hear in Russia itself, and you hear in much Western reporting and much Western intelligence analysis on the Caucasus region, particularly on the North Caucasus. And the narrative goes something like this: that it is a turbulent and restive and unstable region, that there has been a Muslim insurgency in the North Caucasus linked up with global jihad for going on 20 years or so now, perhaps even longer than that, that the region is Russia's principal security problem. And in fact, that was a line that was used by President Medvedev himself way back in 2009 when Dmitry Medvedev was still Russian president, that has produced a terror campaign across Russia. From Budyonovsk, the Budyonovsk hospital siege in 1995, the Nordost siege in which insurgents took control of a Moscow theater in 2002, leaving about 130 people dead. The Beslan tragedy of 2004, that is the killing of close to 400 individuals after insurgents took control of a school in the North Caucasus region. The bombing of the Nevsky Express train between Petersburg and Moscow in 2009, the bombing of the Moscow Metro in 2010, and the list goes on and on. that it's a region of incredible poverty, a region of incredible lack of opportunity, in which especially young men often find no prospect but joining a jihadist or other radical movement. And that finally, the North Caucasus is a kind of multi-ethnic jumble, that if you looked at an ethnic or linguistic map of the region, what you would find is a whole range, a whole rainbow of different kinds of colors. A place that is consistently, as a result, resistant to Russian rule. That it's, in short, a mess. So this is the standard narrative that we often hear about the region, and one that over the course of the talk today I would like to unpack a little bit. Because I think there is so much about the North Caucasus that we don't understand, so much that Russians themselves don't understand, but I want to try to make a little bit of sense of it today for you, if I might. Let me begin by trying to argue for why I think this particular narrative of the North Caucasus is unhelpful, the narrative that I just laid out to you. First of all, words like turbulence and tension and instability are not things. They're metaphors for the way that we perceive the world. When we speak about a region as being full of turbulence or full of instability, we're really trying to capture in a metaphorical sense what we think is going on there. But those things, turbulence, is unobservable. It's a way of talking about a set of problems and perceptions. It's not a thing in itself. So I think we need to be aware of that. In fact, in most reporting on the North Caucasus, you might think that its official name is the turbulent North Caucasus with a capital T, because, of course, that's the way in which we normally talk about things there. But I'm going to argue in just a moment for why we need to put that in some perspective. Secondly, if we believe that the Caucasus is a region of Russia that has been historically rebellious and resistant to Russian rule, I think we need to rethink that. The long wars of the 19th century, in which there was violence in the Caucasus that involved, to some degree, local Caucasus communities fighting the forces of the Russian Empire, had ended by 1864. So if we are thinking of a region that's been consistently rebellious, we would have to go back before 1864 to find large-scale rebellion that had a historical root to it. There was certainly banditry, there were certainly attacks on Russian soldiers after the 1860s, but the region had become more or less fully incorporated into the Russian state by that point. We might say, to take an American example, that the Caucasus has been precisely as resistant to Russian rule as the American South, which is where I come from, has been resistant to American rule. Both of the regions were incorporated fully into their states in the 1860s. Secondly, there were very successful Soviet efforts throughout the period after the 1860s to preempt resistance, to incorporate the peoples of the Caucasus into Soviet structures of governance. Some of those systems were peaceful and with the same kind of mechanisms of incorporation you would have seen in virtually any other part of the Soviet state. Others of those were, of course, what we might describe as genocidal, particularly the deportations of Chechens and Ingush and others in 1944. Those efforts, however, turned out to be rather successful if we think of them as techniques of preempting rebelliousness and resistance. In fact, if we're thinking about Soviet history as a whole, if we're looking for instances in which resistance to the Soviet state took a particularly ethnic form, that is, if we're interested in cultural or religious or linguistic communities resisting consistently Soviet rule, we ought to look in areas, I think, beyond the Caucasus. In fact, it's much easier to make that kind of argument that there has been a long-term resistance to Soviet/Russian rule in places like the Baltics or in Western Ukraine than in the Caucasus, frankly. So we need to adjust our thinking about the role of ethnicity. And then even when it comes to resistance, I think in the Caucasus, resistance to central rule from Russia or elsewhere that is non-ethnic has probably dwarfed what we might describe as ethnic resistance. For example, the resistance to collectivization in the countryside in the 1930s. We would want to put that in the category of resistance to Soviet rule, even though we wouldn't describe that as an ethnic form of uprising. The third major way in which I think we need to adjust our common perception of the Caucasus as rebellious and turbulent and so forth that I was just describing a bit earlier is that over the very recent period, over the last 5 years or so, even the forms of violence that we're most accustomed to talking about in the Caucasus, that is so-called jihadist violence, attacks on Russian security and military personnel by members of, for example, the Caucasus Emirate, the main jihadi group in the North Caucasus, even that form of violence has declined considerably. If we look at the group that actually counts these things, the website Caucasian Not, which keeps a running tally of casualties in the Caucasus, we can see that every year since 2010, the number of casualties has fallen. And 2010 was the year when Caucasian Not started keeping tabs on these things. So the total number of people killed in the North Caucasus insurgency between 2010 and 2014 is just under 6,000 people. So 5,816 people to be precise. By far the largest number of those in the period that Caucasian Not has been keeping count are in two republics, in Dagestan just over here to the east, and in Kabardino-Balkaria here in the central North Caucasus, not in Chechnya. These days, Chechnya is probably one of the more peaceful regions of the North Caucasus. Let's drill down into those numbers a bit. In 2014, the last full year for which Caucasian Not has figures, a total of 341 people were killed in the so-called North Caucasus insurgency, 341 people. Of those 341, 249 were classed by the Russian agencies reporting on these things as militants. So 249 out of the 341 were classed by the Russians as militants. In other words, 73% of the people being killed in the North Caucasus insurgency are themselves North Caucasus insurgents. That ought to cause you to scratch your head for a moment. First of all, if we look at this in relative terms, that, folks, is less than the murder rate in Chicago. It's considerably less than the murder rate in Chicago or New York or Detroit or my home city of Washington, D.C. There are around 9.5 million people in the North Caucasus district. We're talking about an insurgency that purportedly claimed 341 victims. All of them, of course, tragedies for the families concerned, but on a global scale, this is very small. Secondly, the thing that I think better characterizes what has been happening in the North Caucasus, certainly since 2009 or so, since the end of the Second Chechen War, is what I think the group Human Rights Watch quite rightly characterized as Russia's dirty war in the Caucasus. The people being killed in the North Caucasus insurgency are, by and large, young Muslim men who are targeted by Russian security services. They are not, by and large, people targeted by the North Caucasus insurgents. And the difference between those things, between a civil war or an insurgency or a jihadist movement on one hand, and a dirty war, that is, an authoritarian state cracking down and in many instances simply assassinating young men in the region, is important to keep in mind. So the reality in the North Caucasus today, it seems to me, is a real and deadly but very, very low-scale insurgency inspired by the global jihadist networks, about which I'll say more in a moment, that is matched and, in fact, exceeded by a real, deadly, and massive crackdown by an authoritarian state. So we need to adjust the way in which we're thinking about these things. So how has this situation come about? How has all of this, this perhaps alternative view of the region that I was trying to sketch out. How has all of this come about? Well, a couple of things I think have happened over the last few years that we need to be aware of. First of all, there has been a steady Russian retreat in many ways from the North Caucasus in all but a security sense. The way in which most people in the region interact with the Russian state, and certainly the way in which they interact with central organs of the Russian state, is primarily through federal security services, either through local intelligence services or through the Russian military. That has gone hand in hand with a massive out-migration of ethnic Russians that began in the late Soviet period, accelerated in the early post-Soviet period, and has continued into the early 2000s. In fact, all of the republics of the North Caucasus, from Karachay-Cherkessia all the way to Dagestan, this little island of a place, Adygea, is not formally inside the North Caucasus Federal District. But all of the republics from Karachay-Cherkessia to the east are now more indigenous, if you like, at any point since the beginning of the 19th century. Amazing demographic change in the Caucasus. From the 18 teens or so, when the military of the North Caucasus began, all the way up until the teens of the region has been progressively de-Russianized, if you like, sort of Russians moving into the region in the imperial period and the Soviet period, and now moving out of the region later on. So where the Russians, I think, where the Russian state now, how the Russian state now perceives the North Caucasus is essentially as a form of uncertain and unsteady colonial management. What do you do if you're administering a colony? Well, to a degree, you rely on local elites. You retreat your involvement in the region to essentially military or security operations. You manage the periodic changeover of elites so that the move from one local elite to another local elite doesn't affect that essential colonial relationship. And you allow for little sources of independent power or wealth apart from connections to the state. And I'll say a word or two more about that in just a moment. But that, I think, is the shape of Russian policy in the region at the moment. It's the way in which the Caucasus relates to the rest of the Russian Federation. Another key aspect, though, of this colonial behavior is using violent entrepreneurs from the region, especially from Chechnya, as a kind of convenient set of shock troops, or not to put too fine a point on it, a convenient set of assassins for political opponents at home. And over time, I think this is particularly among liberal Russians, this is the way in which Chechens and others in the North Caucasus are now perceived. They are the individuals who are called upon to do the dirty work of the Russian state domestically, but otherwise kept at a kind of arm's length. What that has led to is, in turn, I think, a growing disconnect between the Russian public and the North Caucasus and vice versa. We've seen over the last 10 years increasing prejudice among many ethnic Russians in other parts of the Russian Federation toward migrants from the North Caucasus, particularly in the cities. And here the work of Kolstad and Blakasrud is very important in giving us some survey data on how local migrants and others are perceived. But even among liberals in Russia, I think a growing belief that Vladimir Putin's system has come to, in the North Caucasus anyway, has come to rely on a few key features. The domination of the local economy in the region, whether it's in Kabardino-Balkaria or Dagestan, or the domination of the local economy by people who are loyal to the central state, loyal to United Russia and to Putin himself, using the party structure of United Russia to ensure that only candidates who are loyal to the system are elected at the local level, and that votes are delivered up for United Russia in all federation elections. and then particularly in Chechnya itself, of the leader of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, as a kind of enforcer, not only domestically within Chechnya itself, but as a kind of enforcer at the all-federation level, someone who can be called upon when needed by Vladimir Putin himself. Many Russian journalists now refer to Ramzan Kadyrov as the second most powerful man in the Russian Federation, and that's probably not far wrong. We ignore what happens in the North Caucasus at our peril if someone from the North Caucasus is now routinely described as the second most powerful man in the country. And of course, we've seen over the last several months an increase in Kadyrov's attacks on oppositionists in other parts of the Russian Federation, particularly on Mikhail Khodorkovsky and his associates, attacks on human rights groups in Chechnya and at the all-federation level. This, I think, is very much a coordinated policy, not just Kadyrov's own initiative. So what we see is, in so many ways, the overall emergence of the North Caucasus as a region that is very much in Russia and plays a very important part at the highest strategic levels in the way that the Putin system works, but in so many ways at the social level, not of Russia, in Russia, but not of Russia, a kind of frontier zone that is less integrated at the social level with the rest of the Russian Federation than perhaps at any point since the 1860s or so. And that's a remarkable development over the last 20 years, over the post-Soviet period. The progressive frontierization of the North Caucasus, and a great change from how the region was thought of, how the region was governed, how it was perceived, even during the Soviet period. That's a real change. I want next to highlight a few of the key developments, though, that I think will determine the future of the region in the near term. Because things are changing rapidly in the Caucasus, things are always changing rapidly in the Caucasus, and we need to have a kind of framework for understanding how some of those changes are likely to proceed. And as a frame, I'd like to use the British strategist Lord Ismay's famous line about NATO. He was once asked what the purpose of NATO was as a military alliance, and he famously said the point was to keep the United States in, Russia out, and Germany down. But I would like to sort of use that frame as a way of talking about the Caucasus. Nothing to do with NATO, of course, but Ismay's framing is kind of interesting. And I think the overall Russian strategy in the region today is to keep elites in, that is, to keep local elites inside the North Caucasus, remaining part of the Russian system of governance, and I'll say more about that in a moment, to keep foreign influence out, and to keep the insurgency, as Russians perceive it, down. So to keep elites in, foreign influences out, and the insurgency down. So what do I mean by keeping elites in? Well, it's important to remember that even though I've been talking about this entire space as a kind of region, politics in each of the republics of the North Caucasus is very distinct. The system and how it works in each of the North Caucasus republics, from Karachay-Cherkessia over to Dagestan, is distinct. So you have in Chechnya itself what you might describe as authoritarianism in one family. Ramzan Kadyrov succeeding his father after his father was assassinated has created a system in which it is the Kadyrov family and the broader Kadyrov clan that calls the shots. It is the only game in town. There is no prospect of a transition away from the Kadyrovs anytime soon. It is an authoritarian system, one might even say verging on a totalitarian system par excellence. And that is a way in which I think Ramzan Kadyrov himself wants the system to be structured, and it's a way that, from the central Russian government's point of view, I think, is the best option for containing what had been, of course, a secessionist conflict, and there are two secessionist conflicts in the region from 1994 on. If you step back and think about the situation of Chechnya for a moment, it's remarkable it's a remarkable success case of Russia's transforming what had been a large secessionist movement. In fact, a secessionist movement that we might say by 1996 had defeated the Russian central government, that transformed itself in 1999 into a large-scale Islamic-inspired insurgency, into the leader of this unit becoming the second most powerful man in the Russian Federation. That's a remarkable change from 1994, and one might say a very successful strategy on the part of the Russian Federation itself. The price of that has, of course, been a recognition of the power of Kadyrov and his associates to do virtually anything they want in Chechnya itself, and occasionally even edging up to the idea that the only law in Chechnya is Kadyrov, not even federal law. 2 weeks ago, Ramzan Kadyrov famously said that if Russian Interior Ministry troops came into Chechnya and engaged in activities without his prior consent, Chechen Interior Ministry and police forces were allowed to shoot those individuals on site. Contrast that with a very different system in Dagestan, for example, where you have not only a very ethnically diverse region, but also a whole variety of different clans which vie for power at the same time. And the role of the president there, or the head of the local administration, I should say, we use the term head rather than president now, the head of the local administration, Abdullah Tipov, his role is in so many ways to manage what is a very complex set of clan interests in Dagestan. Contrast that again with a place like Kabardino-Balkaria, farther to the west. Over the last 20 years or so, Kabardino-Balkaria has settled into what we might describe as a periodic rotation of cadres, to use a great old Stalinist term, where two principal clans, one associated with the head of the local administration, Valery Kokov, and his associates, another associated with the former head of the local administration, Arsen Konokov, have worked out a way in which, over time, they simply transfer power back and forth from one set of clan interests to the next. And this has now happened on 3 separate occasions, where if you didn't know anything about the Caucasus, if you were a Martian political scientist and came down and were trying to understand the nature of politics in Kabardino-Balkaria, you might say, well, this looks to me like an alternation in power of 2 different political parties. This looks like democracy to me. And you would sort of say that compared to having perhaps a deeply authoritarian state such as Chechnya, Kabardino-Balkaria has worked out a form of movement of individuals back and forth from one administration to the next. I wouldn't describe that as democratic, but I would describe it as, in some ways, competitive. There's more of a competitive political system there than democratic governance, for example, have always been trying to find the really optimistic case when it came to questions of responsive government and elections that actually look like elections. Right at the moment, the one that is, I think, receiving the most attention is probably Karchay-Cherkessia, where there is a younger, more energetic local head of the administration, Rashid Temrezov, that has received a lot of attention abroad as someone who seems to be interested in moving his region into modernity in so many ways. But I would just add that position was previously held by Arsen Konokov in Kabardino-Balkaria. Arsen Konokov was meant to be the sort of great forward-thinking, more progressive, perhaps more liberal political leader there, and it really turned out not to be the case. Elite politics, however, in this region, keeping with this theme of keeping elites in, elite politics in the region really is the only game in town. By that I mean that every job in the North Caucasus that anyone might hold depends on having ties to the state. There is simply no other way of succeeding, no other way of making a living, whether you're an independent business person or someone who's actually working for the state administration. There is simply no way of surviving without access to the state. And that means, of course, then that you as an individual are supremely tied to whoever happens to be in power, and you're constantly sort of assessing power relations within your own republic. There is, in other words, a cascading system of patronage that defines politics and economic life in the Caucasus that runs all the way from the center of the Russian state, particularly central development funds from the state budget that are given to entities in the North Caucasus for development projects, all the way down to regional elites in each of the national capitals in the region, down to virtually every sector of government life, from local police forces to the educational system, which is all, of course, state-dominated as well. So that's keeping elites in the game, maintaining that system of patronage, making sure that the state is the only game in town, and making sure that Moscow has ultimate say in which elites come to power, and how they relate to the Russian center is very much the order of the day. Secondly, keeping foreign influence out. It was interesting in the early 2000s, when I was spending a fair amount of time in the North Caucasus, all the way up until 2009 or 2010, there was, to a degree, a kind of opening, I think, of the region, particularly during the Medvedev presidency. There were foreign NGOs and human rights organizations, local educational groups that had come into the region, setting up local offices, even American NGOs operating in some parts of the region, particularly in Kabardino-Balkaria and elsewhere. All of those, I would say, have now been closed down. There simply is no access to the region in the way that there had been a bit earlier on. There was also, in the early 2000s until about 2010 or so, a rise in the region of what we might call diaspora politics. As the region became more integrated with the rest of the world, as the internet came to the North Caucasus, local nationalist groups, and I use that term nationalist in a kind of mild way, local nationalist or patriotic groups increasingly reached out to diaspora communities abroad. The most important example of that is probably the emergence of a thing called the Circassian world concept that involved the two of the ethnic groups, the Circassians and Kabardians, but also the Adige in Adygea, grouped together under one pan-ethnic label called Circassian, and their efforts to reach out to Circassian communities all the way from Lebanon to New Jersey in the United States. And there was the idea of holding a Circassian Olympic Games modeled on the Maccabee Games in Israel and for Jewish communities around the world, that this would be a way of sort of creating a pan-ethnic identity, uniting Circassians around the world. This idea, as you can imagine, sparked a fair amount of interest in Moscow, because not only did it look like local political elites, particularly under the presidency of Arsen Konokov in Kabardino-Balkaria, were using local nationalism as a way of creating an independent source of power for Moscow. And I go back to my first point about keeping elites in the system rather than having them have alternative and independent forms of legitimacy locally. That was a problem in terms of elite politics. But it also was a problem because it connected Circassians in the North Caucasus to the world without having to go through Moscow first. In other words, they had these sort of these networks of individuals literally spreading around the world that created a kind of independent source, again, of legitimacy or power from Moscow. All of this became a casualty, I have to say, of the run-up to the Sochi Olympics, when in Kabardino-Balkaria and Karachay-Cherkessia, Adygea, you had the either harassment or in some cases the actual arrest of people who were involved in this Circassian world idea. Because just at the same time that the Russian state was cracking down on jihadists who they thought perhaps presented some threat, some security threat to the Sochi Games, at the same time people who could be branded as local nationalists were also targeted. And today, then, throughout the North Caucasus, the symbolism of the region is totally different from what it might have been before 2010 or so. The symbolism over the last 4 or 5 years has been massive public displays of loyalty to the Russian state on the model of the old Soviet system. So the return of these sort of gigantomania public festivals, which simply didn't exist beforehand. Many of those are a time to be coordinated with some anniversary of a local republic's incorporation into the Russian state. So the celebration of the 450th anniversary of Russian fill-in-the-blank relations is a very common feature across the region. And of course, each of those are sort of modular concepts. The celebration in Dagestan looks exactly like the celebration in Kabardino-Balkaria, which looks exactly like the celebration in Karchay-Cherkessia. You just change the names. Very much a return of that Soviet-style politics as celebration. And third point, keeping the insurgency down. Well, in the first part of my talk, I tried to argue that the degree to which we think there is a large-scale insurgency at all, I think, should be questioned. And many analysts sort of debate this. They debate, analysts in the West, that is, whether the degree to which the Caucasus Emirate, the most well-known of the insurgent groups, the degree to which the Caucasus Emirate can be thought of as a thing, or should it be thought of instead as a website? And so we can debate ourselves whether it is one thing or the other, or perhaps both at the same time. But I do think there are three more or less objective trends going on here that we want to keep in mind. First of all is the decline in the ability of insurgent groups, however large or however well coordinated they might be, a decline in their ability to stage large-scale attacks. The greatest exception to that was in Chechnya itself in December of last year, in which you had 2 days, more or less 2 days of fighting in Grozny between insurgent attackers, perhaps associated with the Caucasus Emirate and the forces of Kadyrov himself, but I see that as more of an intra-Chechen struggle than I see it as an ability by the Caucasus Emirate written large to engage in large-scale attacks. The other thing that's interesting about that is that it's the largest attack by clearly insurgent Caucasus Emirate forces inside the North Caucasus itself. Most of those attacks were typically directed at Russian targets outside of the North Caucasus. And there was a kind of theological or ideological reason for that. You're sort of taking the fight to the infidels rather than killing people inside the region itself, unless you're talking about individual attacks on soldiers or collaborators. But these large-scale, fantastic, magnificent, hugely headline-garnering attacks were things that typically took place outside the North Caucasus. But I think the ability of the insurgent forces to stage those kinds of things has probably declined over time. Secondly, the Russian state has been actually quite successful in making the leadership of the North Caucasus Emirate, or the Caucasus Emirate, into the world's most dangerous job. The average time in office for the leader of the North Caucasus Emirate is now about a year before that person is assassinated by or otherwise killed by Russian forces. And of course, the most recent holder of that office, who appears to be, although this has not yet been confirmed, I believe, by the Kafka Center, which is the main website that the Caucasus Emirate uses. The current holder of that role, a person named Abu Usman, who took over allegedly after the killing of Ali Abu Muhammad just a couple of months ago. It will be interesting to see how long that individual seems to last in that position. The third important development, though, in insurgent terms, is what we might describe as the progressive avarization of the Caucasus Emirate. The Avars are, of course, an ethnic group located in Dagestan in the east. And now, if Abu Usman has in fact succeeded Ali Abu Muhammad as leader of the Caucasus Emirate, that would make the second leader of the emirate in a row who is not a Chechen. And that's important, I think, because it may well indicate that the leadership of the Caucasus Emirate has undergone the same kind of change that the violence in general in the North Caucasus has undergone. The locus of violence in the North Caucasus now is not Chechnya. The locus of violence inside the North Caucasus is, of course, Dagestan here in the east. Even just as an aside, even in the United States, in the wake of the Boston Marathon bombing, when everyone in sort of the U.S. media for a while was trying to create links between the Boston bombers and Chechen national identity, or the fact that Chechens were somehow given to being natural jihadists, what people missed is that if you were looking for any kind of regional roots to the Boston bombing, of which there were, in my view, none, the place you would look would be where the families of those individuals were actually from, which is Dagestan, not Chechnya itself. The other thing with the insurgency that I think is worth noting, in addition to the shift from a Chechen-led movement in the North Caucasus to perhaps now a Dagestani or Avar-led movement in the North Caucasus, is that now, on a global scale, the jihadis in the North Caucasus have a kind of rival, and that's, of course, the Islamic State. What you've seen over the last year or so is the defection of key Caucasus Emirate leaders to the Islamic State, either in conceptual terms that they declare publicly, usually via their Twitter feed, that they are now loyal to the Islamic State rather than loyal to the emir of the Caucasus Emirate. Or in some instances, and numbers here are very difficult to come by, in some instances, of course, leaving the Russian Federation itself and going to join the fighting in Syria. On the one hand, of course, this is a troubling development because it signals, yet another way in which ISIS is a kind of global threat, if you like. But on the other hand, it may take some of the pressure off the North Caucasus itself. If some of the most talented members of the North Caucasus Emirate are now defecting, perhaps actually leaving the region itself and going to fight in Syria over the short term, that is less of a problem for Russian or local security services in the region. So where does all of that leave us? Well, let me just recap and highlight a few themes, and then I'm very happy to continue the discussion with you from that table over there. First of all, as I said, fighting in the North Caucasus is no longer the dominant theme in Caucasus politics. Violence itself is no longer, I think, the principal issue there. The scale we have to keep in mind. The scale of violence we have to keep in mind, and the people who are actually doing most of the dying we have to keep in mind, and those are young men who are targeted as by Russian security services. The concept of frontier management, which I think is the dominant theme now in the way that the Russian Federation approaches this part of its own country, there is hope of actually integrating the North Caucasus with the rest of Russia. I think over the long term, the trend in the North Caucasus is going to continue to be people in the North Caucasus really not thinking of themselves as part of the Russian Federation, and people in other parts of Russia kind of liking it that way. And that's, over the long term, a kind of dangerous development, I think, for the stability of the Russian Federation as a whole. We are talking about, especially if you include Krasnodar Krai, sort of the area farther to the west in the North Caucasus, we're talking about more than 10 million people in the Russian Federation, increasingly feeling themselves to be disconnected from the rest of their state. And over the longer term, this is a particular challenge for Russia because all of the normal tools that a state might use in order to solve that problem aren't available to the Russian Federation. You don't have elections that are meaningful, and so the elections themselves create no safety valve for discontent. The reason for that is, of course, Russia has been worried that if you allow elections in the region itself, particularly for the heads of North Caucasus republics, that will put in place a form of ethnic outbidding by local political elites. Let me just dwell on that point for a moment because it's important. The reason you don't have elections in the North Caucasus from the Russian state's perspective is not because Russians are congenital authoritarians. That's not the issue. It's not even because Putin loves being an authoritarian. That's not the issue. The issue is because there is, in fact, a dynamic at work that would be inimical to and difficult for the Russian central government to resolve. Let's imagine you had elections tomorrow for the presidency of Kabardino-Balkaria or Ingushetia, say. The only way that local elites, since the only game in town is the United Russia Party, the only way that local elites could put forward a program that would be meaningful to a local electorate would be by playing the nationalist card. And there would be, I think, immediately a kind of ratcheting up of the nationalist card by each of the candidates for whatever office you're talking about. So from the Russian state's perspective, the problem of nationalism, the problem perhaps eventually of secessionism, would be given if you were to engage in more responsive politics on the ground. So elections aren't there as a kind of safety valve. The younger generation in the region, I think, is less and less connected with the rest of the Russian state. They are more likely to speak the indigenous language as their primary language. Russian language capabilities, from all we can tell, are declining, even though you have education at the secondary and tertiary levels. Many of them, many young people in the region are more likely to see connection either with co-ethnics abroad or with Turkey or with other states outside the Russian Federation as their natural pole of attraction. Rather than Moscow or Petersburg as the natural pole of attraction. And that is compounded by the fact that when they go to Russian, either regional centers or the Russian capital, they are perceived by many Russians as inherently criminal or inherently backward or a threat somehow to the Russian state. So if you've got a region that is perceived as a kind of frontier, if it's perceived as the locus of most of your problems, if it is perceived, as Medvedev said in 2009, as your principal security threat, what happens to the people who happen to live there? Well, they themselves are also perceived by many Russians as criminals, as thugs, as Muslim radicals, as the principal security threat of the state. And that, I think, over time, makes it less and less likely that the North Caucasus will eventually become both in Russia and of it. I'll stop there. So thanks very much, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Well, thank you so much, Charles, for a fantastic speech. Am I on? Yeah, good. Very lucid, illuminating, sober, I guess we could say anti-alarmist, at least with your comparison with the levels of violence in American cities. But nevertheless, a region which is extremely important and which we ignore only at our own peril. So I'm sure there are many knowledgeable people in the audience, and I will take your names, or at least try to remember where the finger went up. So we can welcome both questions and comments, but please keep your interventions short and pointed. And if you try to develop into some kind of talk number 2, I will probably have to cut you short. So please, the floor is yours. I mean, well, it takes a little time for
to
get started. Julia, our Caucasus expert at NUPI. Yeah, and please all of you introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Julie Wilhelmsen. I'm with this institute.
Hi.
Hi. I have a question concerning Chechnya.
Yeah.
And just wondering how long we will be able to call Kadyrov's rule over Chechnya a success. We're trying to write a book here at NUPI on kinship and international relations. So I'm working on how does kinship work as the tie between Moscow and Kadyrov and inside Chechnya. I've also had some comments lately from Chechens in Norway who are saying that things are changing and that the satisfaction people have had through Kadyrov's rule for some time, being, rebuilding Grozny, some kind of peace or seeming peace, that the satisfaction might be running out. So I'm wondering, to what extent can the shootings in December, can they reflect a new rebellion inside Chechnya towards Kadyrov? Not necessarily as an Islamist rebellion, but as a rebellion in a republic which is usually very egalitarian in its organization and now is structured like a pyramid with one person on top, very un-Chechen way of organizing society.
Yeah.
So your comment on that would be welcome.
That's an absolutely great question. I think in so many ways it's the central question about what happens in Chechnya going forward. I think Ramzan Kadyrov is young enough at this point that he hasn't even begun to think about problems of succession. And that's perhaps the downside of having an authoritarian leader who also happens to be a very young leader. If you have an authoritarian leader who happens to be really quite old, and there are other examples in the post-Soviet space of this, at some point you begin to think, well, how do I maintain this system after I'm gone? But if you can't imagine yourself being gone, there's no reason to begin thinking along those terms. I don't see the December 2014 attacks, however, as being a sign of a growing insurgency inside Chechnya itself, because of course there were earlier attacks that were particularly on Kadyrov himself. Not only, particularly the famous attack on his home village of Centeroy. So these I think are particular examples of the way in which the Caucasus Emirate or its divisions periodically seek to engage in high-profile, very public attacks to convince other members of the emirate, principally, and perhaps funders even from abroad, that they're able to engage still in large-scale coordinated attacks. The fact that they're doing it in a place like Centeroy or they're doing it in a place like Grozny is, to me, an indication of how the insurgency overall has shrunk. These are not attacks, for example, in Moscow or bringing down airliners, those spectacular instances of terrorism that one might have been engaged in some time ago. They're very, very local. And on that score, they're much more like, to my mind, the 2005 attack in Nalchik, by Kabardian members, allegedly members of the North Caucasus Emirate. And by the way, as some of you may have followed this, the 57 or so people who have been on trial for the last 4.5 years for those attacks were recently sentenced. And in fact, given sentences which I think many people sort of observing this from the outside thought were sentences that were extraordinarily light in a way compared to what the local Kabardian courts might actually have given out. So I don't see this as indication of a large-scale emergence of an anti-Kadyrov coalition. I think Kadyrov has so far been pretty successful at using force as a way of taking out most of the people who would be most opposed to him, using intimidation tactics against the rest, and then just the right amount of positive incentives, the rebuilding program that you mentioned, to try to get everyone else on his side. I think another thing in Kadyrov's advantage is his growing importance to the Putin administration. I think he's more important to Vladimir Putin now at the kind of all-federation level than he might have been 2 or 3 years ago. And the problem is that in a way, both of our predictions pointed exactly the same causes or both of our analyses point at the same causes, because, of course, if Kadyrov were feeling weaker domestically in Chechnya, his logical strategy would be to try to enhance his relationship with Putin and his importance at the all-federation level. So these may be famous last words, but I'm more optimistic, can I use that word? Optimistic about Kadyrov's chances of staying around and remaining in power than otherwise we might think.
Okay.
I don't know if you can be optimistic about a deeply authoritarian ruler staying in power, but that you see what I mean.
So anybody else would like to go? Please, and say your name, please.
My name is Anna. I'm an intern at NUPI and I'm studying at the OSCE Academy. Several months ago, we had a meeting with Maloshenko, who is a scientist from Russia. And he also was talking about Chechnya and the participation of Chechen citizens in events in Syria. And he was saying that actually there are much more Chechens in Syria than citizens of Central Asia. How will you put this discourse into your vision of Chechen as a peaceful republic right now?
Yeah. So the number of fighters, the number of foreign fighters in general in Syria is, of course, unknown. And the numbers vary widely. From a few dozens to a few hundreds to, on the largest assessments, a few thousand, particularly from the North Caucasus and from Central Asia, from Afghanistan and elsewhere. So the short answer is nobody actually knows. And so any analysis that we build on top of a number that nobody knows is going to be a pretty shaky analysis. I think a thing that we do know, however, is a lot of people talk about there being foreign fighters in Syria, and a lot of people talk about the impact that is likely to have back on the Russian Federation itself or on Central Asian states. And to me, that is much more of an indication of the way in which we are continually looking for sources of instability in the North Caucasus rather than thinking about the forces of stability, frankly, in the region. This may go back to my response to the previous question. I am much more willing, I think, or much more prone to think about things in the North Caucasus being more stable, having the system there being more reliable to those who are engaged in the system itself, and being perhaps a little longer lasting than we might think. I think that's a bad thing for the people who happen to live in the North Caucasus. I think many of them are at the whim of governments that are deeply authoritarian and are likely to remain so for some time to come. But I am less. I think I'm less worried about the principal thing that Maloshenko and others often talk about, which is what happens when the fighters in Syria come back to the Russian Federation, and will we therefore see a return of violence in the North Caucasus? Over the short term, I'm less concerned about that than, frankly, the violence that is meted out every day by the security services of the Russian state. And I think, if you take one thing away from what I've tried to argue today, it's that we need to flip our discourse on the sources of violence in the North Caucasus. There is an underground, there is an insurgency, there are fighters who have had experience abroad and have come back to the North Caucasus, but the level of violence that those individuals engage in the North Caucasus is dwarfed by the level of violence created by the Russian state and its associates in the region.
Okay. Let me pose a question. Of course, I guess we can agree that Ramzan Kadyrov's rule is based basically on brute force, violence, even terror. But it also has an ideological side. He's playing on this religious issue, Islamization, and he's a son of an imam, and nobody, I guess, would believe that he is devout Muslim himself, but he's using the Islamization actively. And so my two questions are, to what extent do you see this as a successful strategy to steal the thunder from the Islamists in the region? And to what degree would you assess the regimes in the other North Caucasian republics as being secularist or playing the same game as Kadyrov is doing?
That's a great question. So only Kadyrov, I think, has successfully tried to wrap himself in the mantle of religious leader at the same time as being a political leader. No one else, Temrezov, Kokov, Konokov, Abdullatipov, Yevkurov, and Ingushetia, no one else does this.
Okay.
Everyone, of course, has to pay lip service to religious devotion. That's a normal kind of part of being a good politician in a religious environment. But no one has tried to do this at the level of Kadyrov and to create an entire regime that has religion wrapped inside it. Secondly, no one has tried to create their own personal version of Islam in the way that Kadyrov has tried to do, because Kadyrov himself, in his heart of hearts, may or may not be particularly devout, but what is very clear is that he has created his own kind of synthesis of Orthodox Islam, Sufi traditions, Chechen common law or adat, his own musings about the world. This is much more like Muammar Gaddafi, frankly, and the way in which you fashion your own kind of green book of ideology to go along with your rule. So I would see him much more in that kind of vein than as a religious prophet or zealot. So I think he's been rather successful at crafting such an ideology. Does anyone really believe it? Does anyone really take it seriously, apart from the need to pay obeisance to it? Probably not. But it's a thing that he's tried to do with great aplomb.
So you don't think that this is part of the explanation why the insurgency is going down, that they have difficulty getting the message across as being different from
No, in fact, I think if anything, what you've seen is that the insurgents themselves continually stress the differences between, I mean, if you I wouldn't recommend that you do this a lot, but if you go and watch the videos on Kavkaz Center from the various insurgent groups in the North Caucasus, particularly the sayings of and announcements of whoever the leader of the North Caucasus Emirate happens to be at the time, and they're all there on the website or on YouTube, for that matter, for you to watch, they always begin with an appeal to, in a way, a kind of appeal to orthodoxy, to put away forms of Islam that are heterogeneous and heterodox. But that also, I have to say, has a real historical precedent, particularly in upland Dagestan and in Chechnya, because if you go back to the 19th century, if you go back in which the greatest leader of that period, after whom in some ways Kadyrov models himself, Imam Shamil, the great resistor of Russian rule in the Northeast Caucasus until 1859, Shamil himself was most concerned not with creating an ideological argument against the Russians. In fact, you can read Shamil's letters from that period, and he never, ever in his letters mentions the fight against the Russians. He never even uses the term Russian in all his correspondence. It's the fight against unbelievers on...
Important topic to one of the top authorities on this issue in the world. So don't pass it up. Erika?
Hello, my name is Erika Fatland, and I'm a writer. And this has all been very, very interesting. But to my great disappointment, we have only been talking about the North Caucasus.
Yeah.
And I would very much like to hear your comments on the situation in the South Caucasus, and particularly in Abkhazia and South Ossetia.
Mm-hmm. Good. Well, so yes, I use the term Caucasus, and we've only been talking about the North, but in some ways, that's because, as I was saying, I was sort of joking with Paul a bit earlier, politics in the South Caucasus has become so incredibly predictable compared to what it might have been some time ago, and that, of course, to me, is the great it's the great positive development in the South Caucasus in that there has been a kind of stability there that you would not have predicted some years ago. I can always be upset for various reasons, but politics there looks a little more normal, if you like, than it might have appeared some time ago. There are just a couple of words about Abkhazia and South Ossetia for those of you who might not follow this on a kind of daily basis. So as you know, back in 2008, Abkhazia and South Ossetia both still recognized by most countries in the world as being a part of Georgia. They had fought wars of secession in the early 1990s, and the point we often forget, they had won the wars of secession in the early 1990s. They defeated militarily, with significant help from the Russian Federation, defeated militarily the forces of the Georgian government. And then both of those conflicts settled into a kind of limbo state where Abkhazia and South Ossetia were de facto, from roughly 1993 or so, de facto independent but not de jure independent. Come 2008, and tensions between South Ossetia and the Georgian government had been rising. The government of Mikhail Saakashvili in Georgia attempted to use military force to take South Ossetia back into the Georgian fold. And my sense at the time is that Saakashvili believed that he could do this, and he believed he could do it rather quickly, and he also believed at the time he had been given a kind of green light to do so by the United States government. Whether that was a fantasy or not is another matter, but I think Saakashvili actually believed that at the time. Of course, he didn't do that successfully, and the Russian Federation intervened, hence the 5-day war in August of 2008 between Georgia and Russia. Which is worth remarking, by the way, that with the exception of Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict and Ukraine-Russia conflict, if we can call it that, today it was one of the very few instances in which post-Soviet countries actually fought each other, which is a remarkable development kind of in world politics. If you think about all the potential border disputes in the region, it's an amazing outcome. After the Russian recognition of South Ossetia and Abkhazia after 2008, and Russia's trying to push other countries in the world to do the same, not at all successfully, I have to say. The next stage in this was really at the end of last year, when both Abkhazia and South Ossetia signed treaties of union and cooperation with South Ossetia. The reason was that local opposition groups in both Abkhazia and South Ossetia believed the absorption of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. That was in some ways the negative impact of the Crimea annexation on what was going on in the South Caucasus, because both Abkhazia and South Ossetia said there's no way we want to become another Crimea. What this illustrates to me, and it's something I think that we've long known, is that oddly enough, some of the most competitive politics in the South Caucasus, and I mean genuinely competitive politics, where you have multiple political parties winning elections, losing elections, coming into power, going out of power, actually takes place in these two unrecognized countries, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Compare it to an Azerbaijan, which has close to zero competitive politics, and oddly enough, it's the unrecognized places that are doing a form of competitive election-based governance far better than some of the recognized places. And in fact, I might even put Armenia in that less competitive category as well. So it's an ironic development, of course, that these two entities, which are not going to be recognized by anyone, have fulfilled at least some of the criteria for recognition that we want to see in the international system, which is a form of politics that is also competitive. One other point I'll make about Abkhazia and South Ossetia is you have to remember scale here in all of these places. South Ossetia has perhaps 40,000 people in it, maybe a little less, maybe a little more. Abkhazia has about 150 to 200,000 people, depending on the season. We insist on analyzing these places as if they were China. Really. So we talk about a president, we talk about a prime minister, we talk about a foreign minister, foreign policy, and all of this. This really is like neighborhood elections in a major city. Okay? It's tiny. So the importance of personal relationships, the importance of what we call clan relationships in these places, well, that's a very fancy word, but, you know, I mean, do you talk about clan relations in, you know, Oslo City Council? Well, probably not. I don't know, maybe you do. But, you know, we have to be very, very careful with our terms and metaphors here because they can push us down a road of analysis that really is not appropriate to the context.
Okay, good.
Erica, does that help get at some of these issues, or did you want to raise something else in particular? Yeah.
I interviewed the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Abkhazia some years ago, and he actually also used the example of China, but to my disadvantage, because I made a point that this is very small. Is it actually big enough to function as a nation, as a state?
Yeah.
And then he said, well, what would China say of Norway? To China, can it function as a state?
Right. Well, you know, it's interesting. During the communist period, of course, back in the day when, during the Gorbachev period, when so many states in East Central Europe were, you know, experimenting with their own forms of actual responsive politics and moving out of the Soviet orbit, the last of those to remain in it was, of course, or remain, I should say, not in the Soviet orbit, but remain a really hardline communist state, was Albania. And the Albanians were always given to saying that their real model was China, and that, of course, if you talked about the Albanian-Chinese alliance, it was 1 billion, 3 million strong. Which is to say, you know, it depends on who you sort of tether your cart to.
Okay, Julie, do you want the floor again?
If there are no other...
Yeah, that's fine.
Yes, I was kind of interested in the academic debate in the US, because you presented your version of what's going on in the Caucasus as a different version, where it's fairly similar to mine, for example.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, in the US, are you alone in this version? And in that connection, I know some of the work which Gordon Hahn does, and he reaches out with his stuff. So I'm just curious, could you show us a bit of what it looks like?
So that's a really great question. I mean, I should say the number of people in the U.S. who focus on the Caucasus, and especially the North Caucasus, is pretty small, and so, you know, the debate among us is kind of like elections in South Ossetia. I mean, it's a really small number of people engaged in sometimes really vitriolic debates. I would say when the North Caucasus, or perhaps in general, when the Caucasus, both North and South, garner attention in the United States, it's really through a kind of security lens. And that was one of the things that I was trying to deal with in the talk today, that there's sort of plenty to this region beyond security. The other way in which this place gathers attention is through the democracy and democratization lens. And, you know, it will probably not surprise you that Americans tend to simplify the world. So when we talk about the Caucasus, there are really only two ways in which it's thought of in the policymaking realm. Is it becoming more dangerous, and is that going to be a problem for us? And is it going to become democratic, and how can we help? So those are the two sort of frames. And of course, in trying to understand what's going on the ground, both of those I think are rather unhelpful. You know, and now with former President Saakashvili moving on to Ukraine and taking over the governorship in the Odessa region, the reaction in Washington, strangely enough, was, "Gosh, isn't that great?" I mean, look at the way in which this you know, person who was such a friend of the United States and important to the democratization of Georgia is now helping with the democratization of Ukraine. Well, anyone who watches this a little more closely realizes that that's a rather pie-in-the-sky version, to say the least. I would say where the real difference comes among many American analysts is really on this question of the reality of the Caucasus Emirate as a thing. And someone like Gordon Hahn is whose knowledge of the details of this thing is in so many ways unparalleled. I mean, Gordon is always sort of reading and watching sort of the web videos and so forth of these individuals, and has a remarkable network. He is much more given to the idea that this thing exists, that it has the power to carry out attacks both in the Caucasus and beyond. I am less enthusiastic about that idea. I don't doubt that there is a thing called the Caucasus Emirate, or individuals who say they are associated with it. I don't doubt their ability to have a Twitter account or a website or make videos, or indeed to kill people when they want to do that. I am much less convinced that they have the power to engage in large-scale operations. And in fact, I think the more we treat them as a thing, the more we kind of play into the hands of exactly the way in which a very small group of committed violent people want to carry out their tasks. So I think that's the line of debate.
We had, of course, the Olympics, and everybody expected there to be some terrorist attacks, not necessarily in the Caucasus, but by these jihadists somewhere else in Russia. And we had in Volgograd, but that was a couple of weeks before.
Yeah.
And then after that, nothing.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
So is that the proof that they don't have the ability?
Well, there are only two explanations for that, right? One is that Russian security was so good that it prevented these individuals from engaging. All over Russia was so magnificent that it prevented these individuals from engaging in that. Or, for reasons both tactical or technical, they were simply unable to carry out these attacks. And I think there was not a huge incentive for, first of all, not a huge incentive for the insurgent groups to attack the Olympics in particular. In fact, if you go back and look at some of the statements that were made by one of the predecessor elites, one of the predecessor leaders of the Caucasus Emirate, the person named Doku Umarov, he never singled out the Olympics themselves for attack. He mentioned them, but that was always in the context of targeting other, what he called displays of frivolity in the Russian state. So, we perceived of the Olympics as a kind of big deal that anyone who's a legitimate terrorist would want to attack. That's not the way that Doku Umarov and the Caucasus Emirate sort of perceived of things. And then secondly, I think, what was happening there in the run-up to the Olympics was really, it provided, and the fears of violence provided a really magnificent pretext for a much wider Russian crackdown across the North Caucasus, targeting, of course, not only people who were described as militants, but also the local nationalists, or people who were not radical nationalists, but simply were concerned with Circassian nationalism or what have you. So there was a much wider ranging crackdown. And one of the problems we have, and this will be, I think, to a Norwegian audience, this will come as no surprise, but every time I make this point to Americans, it's something like a kind of revelation. But militant is not a category, right? Militant is, how do you know a militant before you identify one, right? How do you know a militant before you kill one, frankly? It's hard to figure that out. But yet we read the Russian statistics on 300-odd people killed in the North Caucasus, of which 260-odd are militants. And we think, oh, well, they got 260 terrorists. But what does that actually mean? What it means is the Russian state, like, frankly, other states in the world, target individuals and then only afterwards sort of describe them in justifying that killing as having been militants. It may or may not come as a surprise to you, but these issues are not even subjects of debate most of the time in the United States. To give you one example, in America now we use the term radicalization, and then even quite ridiculous terms like self-radicalize. Well, how do you self-radicalize? Although Americans also invented the self-guided tour. Have you heard of this concept? So we're a very individualistic society. But we use these terms as if they're things, in the same way that we talk about the turbulent North Caucasus as if it's a thing, and then proceed to analyze it accordingly. But it's vitally important, I think, particularly in discussions over security issues, and vitally important discussions over matters of life and death, and that's literally what we're talking about, that we begin to unpack some of these categories and realize the way in which the categories given to us by the modern state are not natural kinds. They are, in fact, created in the interests of the state and its servants as well.
Well, Thanks a lot for a fantastic session. I personally learned a lot, and I'm sure the same with the people in the audience. I must say, we do use the term radicalization and self-radicalization also in Norwegian. And I myself, I like to go on self-guided tours with my wife.
Much better than radicalization.
So, I'm sure you now will rush home and buy The Ghost of Freedom and other books published by Charles King, and all his articles keep coming out in Foreign Affairs and other journals. So thank you so much again, Charles, for coming.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.